Well, thank you, Conchita, for that glowing introduction. I'm not sure how much it's deserved. And thank you also for suggesting the title, which, as you see, is Inequality in the European Identity. And you set me a puzzle, because I thought, what am I going to say about this subject? So I decided, let's move on to the little agenda I set for myself, that we could think of it in a variety of ways, this puzzle. And I thought, well, we could treat a historical dimension so that we might want to look back over a bit more than a century to see where Europe stands in the analysis of inequality, and focus in particular on what I consider, or whom I consider, a key European that some of the economists here will know very well, others from social science will also know well, but his name is so well known that perhaps we really don't know enough about him. Then I thought, well, another way we could tackle it is to look at the economics. So we could ask us, well, what do we know about the facts? Is there some kind of fact basis in income and wealth that characterizes Europe in comparison with elsewhere in the world? And then I thought, well, what about attitudes to inequality? Is there something about being European or identifying as European that has a significant impact on attitudes to inequality? So we're focusing, because that's my area, on economic inequality, but on links to other social and political sciences. And I thought, well, we'll do all three. And I thought, I've still got this puzzle. How do we do it? And so Conchita was in London last month, and I asked her about what kind of talk is expected. So I said, well, technical talk. She says, no. Equations, no. So there are no equations. Tables, maybe. So, okay, we've got some. What about pictures? Yes, pictures. So I'm going to get my own back now. She set me a puzzle. I'm going to set her and you a puzzle with the key picture where we're going to start with history right here. And we're going to start with this mysteriously labeled figure 1. Now, some with an economics background here, if they're very sharp-eyed, will know the significance of figure 1. And if you're not sure, I'll give you a misleading clue. So this figure was first drawn by an engineer with a German name who was born in France and worked on Italian railways. And his great achievement, from where this figure comes, was in a small publication, which was duplicated also in a large publication that was published in 1896. And this figure is the very first example for the economists in the audience of what is known as the Pareto diagram. It's the very first one. Now, for those of you to whom economics is a foreign language, or this is a completely new thought, let me emphasize that this research breakthrough in 1896 still is very much relevant to frontier research in economics today. And in fact, very often people come back to this form of analysis named after Pareto in his path-breaking work, and indeed Pareto's influences in many other parts of economics as well. So I thought we might want to just look a little bit at this man and why his life forms a nice historical aspect on the European identity and its connection with inequality. So who is this man? Well, as you can see, he had an engineering background. So his doctoral thesis was the fundamental principles of equilibrium in solid bodies. Yeah? He was a polymath, it's fair to say, in the leading technical economics journal, Econometrica. There was a tribute to him written in 1938. So the fundamental qualities and the mental formation of Pareto are mathematical knowledge and humanistic nature. Pareto, an engineer, in addition to Italian, wrote French in a literary manner, read fluently English, Latin, Greek, and he translated the Greek anthology for the mere pleasure of doing a linguistic exercise, and in his youth had even attempted a comparative analysis of the language of St. Paul and the Attic dialect. I mean, quite a tribute. So he had experience in the world of business, so this managerial role that he had, and he had an interesting family background. So his father was a Genovese from an aristocratic background who had fled Italy, as many others did, in the period which we'll talk about in just a second. His mother was French, and he was born in Paris, and some of you will see Paris, 1848. You're thinking to yourself, this is what we're talking about. No, it was not la Révolution de Février, sondern die Märzrevolution that influenced Pareto's parents. For some reason, they were very, very interested in the political developments, but it was the developments in Germany rather than those in France that particularly influenced them. So they called their son Fritz Wilfried Pareto. E agli amici italiani, è vero, giuro. 10 years later, they moved back to Italy, and he's known today by the Italian version of this name. So if you want a true European in terms of background, somebody who's, when I say Italian father, French mother, I don't know quite how to describe this name here. In Britain, we don't do saints' names, but this kind of secular saint's name is given from a German version, and then eventually does his academic career in Switzerland. So let's go back to this great contribution that he made. Now, so the original pamphlet is quite short, and it makes a very interesting read. It's still, of course, it was originally written in French. It's been translated into a few other languages. And it was, as is much economic research today, data-based. Now, what I found fascinating about the data that he cites, he looks at income data, and he assembles it from a variety of sources. But I find it fascinating, the sources that he chooses. So in each case, he's looking at the number of income intervals, and he's looking at the number of people in that interval or above, and we'll see why that's important in just a moment. So the X there refers to the particular income boundaries, the N refers to everybody who's at that boundary or above, and he got data from his mother's birthplace, he's got data from his father's birthplace, he's got data from his saint's name place, and he's got data from the country where he worked. So I don't know whether this was consciously influenced his choice of data. Kind of interesting. But there was one key set of data on which he focused because of the quality of the data, and I find that particularly fascinating. So this data was provided to him by Sir Robert Giffen, the famous statistician who's known amongst economists for the Giffen paradox and a variety of other things. But it's the same kind of data. It's very rich data. And what is interesting is the way Pareto treated these data right back then in 1896 in a way that echoes current research today. So just in translation from his work, he says, without exaggerating the accuracy of these statistics, which are always affected by the taxpayer's efforts to avoid tax, we can take the numbers provided at least an approximate representation of the phenomenon he's going to look at. Our goal is to examine whether these numbers are randomly distributed or whether they follow some kind of law. Now that's interesting because he wasn't just interested in what's sometimes unkindly known as data mining, but he was a true European pioneer of a method of approach to data. And I find this interesting because some people who work in the area I work in are what I would call distinguished botanists. The remark comes from an Englishman who was an economist. He was a British naval historian, Cyril Northcote Parkinson, who wrote a wonderful book called Parkinson's Law. And he was talking about specialists, particularly academic specialists. And he said, it's not the business of the botanist to eradicate the weeds. Enough for him if he can tell us just how fast they grow. Yeah? So you find other pioneers, perhaps, who were very distinguished botanists. So in my subject, you've got Gini, Corrado Gini, you've got another Italian, of course, Lorenz, Konrad Lorenz, who was a German-American. And I would put them as world-class botanists. But Pareto was something more. He gave us the idea of a model, how to tackle the analysis of inequality. He brought to this model a kind of polymaths approach. And what is remarkable is that much of his work is still prominent in economics. If you happen to have the time to spare and you were to browse through economics journals published, let's say, in the last 12 months, you would be amazed how often Pareto's name is there because of some concept that he thought up in the 1890s or thereabouts. And he was this pioneer in method. It's interesting, in a tribute to him in the Encyclopedia of Mathematics. It was also in the Encyclopedia of Statistics. He said that he showed that in 1896 the distribution of income was asymptotically what we now call Paretian, thus discovering the very first case of a stable non-Gaussian probability distribution. But the tribute in the Encyclopedia of Mathematics is interesting. He says, as a sociologist, he was convinced that economic facts were inseparable from the society which engendered them. And this grew up when he was, in fact, still in his pre-academic days when he was working as an engineer in Italy. So from 1897 till his retirement in 1911, he taught sociology as well as economics. So we should get back to where we're going with this, because the key thing that drove him was that all of this stuff about inequality really matters. It matters to society. So let's just very briefly glance at what his contribution was then and whether it's still relevant today. So we saw this figure 1 before, which he said, well, it's interesting if you look at those values of X, the incomes, and you look at those values of N, the number of people with that income or above, and you plot them on a logarithmic scale, you get these straight lines. We're going to look a bit more at that in just a second. And the other remarkable thing is not only do we get straight lines for the different countries here, here are his estimates of the slope of the straight line, which has become always represented by the symbol alpha. And he says, well, look at England, and you look at the various German localities, and they all seem to have a very similar slope. So that, writing, he says, we find ourselves confronted by a natural law which reveals a tendency for incomes to be arranged in a certain way, at least in the societies and periods considered. Good qualification. It's important to study this law in greater detail as revealed by the evidence, which is what economists do today. And he says these results are quite remarkable. He's looking at these straight line results and the slope. You can figure out the slope. You've got along the horizontal axis, you've got the incomes. On the vertical axis, you've got this number of people greater or equal to that income. And the steeper the slope, the more people are bunched towards the early part of the distribution, so the less there is of the inequality. So the higher the value of alpha, the more equal things are. So countries, for example, with relatively low values of alpha here are relatively unequal, like he called it England. It's not England. We'll come back to that. It's probably Great Britain that's being covered there with those data. You compare that with, for example, what was the situation in Germany, which had a higher value of alpha, so that this was going to be more equal, less unequal. So he says there's certainly a cause that produces the tendency of income to be distributed according to a certain curve. So I thought, well, let's look at Pareto's contribution today. And I picked an example that I had ready-made from Great Britain data in very recent years. This is probably the best official data that we have from the Wealth and Assets Survey. And I did the same thing as Pareto. So along here, we're measuring wealth. Along here, we're looking at the proportion of people that lie above any particular wealth level. And so why don't we just look at what Pareto did? And you see that here we're looking at million, 10 million, so on, of wealth level. And we then plot the numbers, and we get something that looks pretty much like a straight line, those little dots there. So, yeah, this is more or less what Pareto thought. But it's interesting because he covered himself by saying, well, these particular times and data, maybe this works. And now, of course, we've got such good statistical sources that we can look in more detail. And there are a couple of problems that we immediately see. So first of all, there's a whole lot of, although there appears to be a nice straight line there, we now see a whole lot more points there which don't follow the straight line, because we're now able to, which Pareto was not able to do at the time, see the wealth of those who are really not very wealthy. So clearly the Pareto law just affects one bit of the distribution. And then you say, well, if we look at those dots, where is the straight line going? Is it the first straight line I put there, or the second straight line? It could be either of those. And this matters because you're going to end up with different estimates of this concept that Pareto picked up on the slope of the line, which was related to inequality. And it has to do with, effectively, where we consider the Pareto law to apply. So there are various studies which have gone into this in detail just recently. I thought it'd be interesting to look at the counterparts to Pareto's examples from a Dutch economist, Philip Vermeulen. And he acknowledged in his work that it would be prudent to consider different critical high wealth threshold where Pareto's law maybe. So should it be above €500,000 here, above €1 million, above €2 million? And if you remember, when we looked at Pareto's work back in the 19th century, he was getting numbers for the German states around 1.5, 1.6. Now, with Germany, it depends exactly where the cutoff is, because you're going to get a different kind of straight line. But one thing I would draw to your attention, Vermeulen calls it UK. Actually, it's not UK either. Pareto called it England. Vermeulen calls it UK. It's actually somewhere in between. It's Great Britain. But there we go. It's still, if we look at the boundary for €500,000 and upwards, so UK has got a lower alpha, so it's more unequal. But this doesn't apply elsewhere. But nevertheless, it's all within the same sort of area. So why don't we do the following? Look, I don't know which way is west, across the Atlantic. And oh, wow, we see something very different. So here we're, again, from the same paper, we see that now we're looking at a society which is seriously unequal, because these have very, very flat Pareto lines, according to the analysis that he introduced. So in a sense, we could say, well, perhaps there is something in this European identity when you look at it in the light of Pareto contribution, not only of Pareto being the ideal European, but he pointed out that perhaps, he was working solely with European data. When you apply it around the world, maybe European data are a little bit special. Here's another way of looking at the same figures that we had earlier on. And what I've done here is simply to take the value of alpha, and let's look at what the share is in percentage terms of those who are right at the top. And so to read this appropriately, if we take our threshold of €1 million as being the bit that's relevant for Pareto, we see it's 12% in France, 10%, 12% also in Italy, a bit lower in UK, as high as 25% in Germany. But wow, just look at that, ladies and gentlemen, from the point of view of looking across the Atlantic. Now, as I say, this is just on the assumption that Pareto laws hold. What do the facts show? From the actual data, we can see that this is just without trying to put Pareto's model on it. Nevertheless, we can see that for France, Germany and Italy, we're not so far away from the Pareto estimates. In the case of the UK, it depends exactly where you put the threshold. But one thing's clear, which Pareto's analysis shifts us in this direction, that if we were to compare Europe with elsewhere, where elsewhere is the United States, there is clearly a contrast. So I thought, well, that forms a very nice little bridge to the second area that I wanted to talk about, because I said, well, we've talked first about this pioneer from the historical point of view. Now, what about the facts? What do they show us? So let's go there. So we've dealt with diagram figure number 1. We're going to look at figure number 2 now, because we're going to look at inequality from the way that our expert botanists working in economics look at inequality. So I mentioned 2 other pioneers who really did pioneer the statistical methods applied in economics, but didn't have the kind of wider vision that Pareto provided. And here's the standard tool that we use. And I'd just like to take a moment of your time just to explain what's going on here. This is the contribution from Konrad Lorenz, who said, well, a good way of looking at distributions is just to line people up in terms of income, in terms of wealth, or whatever it is, so the proportion of the population here, and up the vertical axis, we're not doing anything like taking logs or anything, so it's just simply 0 to 100% of the population in ascending order of wealth, 0 to 100% of the wealth. So if we look at the bottom 20%, we then want to read off from that, well, what proportion of the total wealth that they have, so that this curve that you get must be this sort of increasing curve, increasing at an increasing rate, because we're progressively picking up people with higher and higher wealth levels. And there's an important link to economic theory. We say, well, look, it is, the way that we usually make these comparisons according to the various economic theories applied, there's a very simple point that if the curve B, as we've got here, lies inside curve A, then B is more equal than A. And in fact, if we took the 45-degree line, which is what I put in here, is a sort of fantasy situation where everybody's got exactly the same wealth, so it's perfectly equal. Well, okay, that may be, if you're not used to it, it strains the imagination a bit, but the thing that convinces a lot of people this might be a useful approach is Gini's contribution. Where he said, well, rather than looking at some complicated curves here, let's give them a number, because you're looking at these two curves and you say, well, one thing that's clear is that the B is closer to the diagonal than A is, and one way of thinking about Jeannie's contribution is simply say, well, color it in. Look at the proportion of that diagram, this shaded area to the whole triangle, and the bigger that shaded area, the more unequal it is. So in other words, if we had something that went like this, we've got a very, very unequal society. So let's look at how, again, what I can call the Pareto countries look when we compare them with the United States, as we did before. So we have France, we have Germany, we have Italy, yes, we're up there. UK, yeah, the flag's still outside, I checked before I came in. And we have the United States. And we do this little trick of drawing the pictures, and we're doing it for various things that we might be interested in. So we might be interested in income. We might be interested in the distribution of assets, the actual resources people have, or sort of an economist term, the net worth, so their wealth minus, taking into account their debts. And straight away, if you follow through the detail of those figures, you see that assets are more unequal than income because the curve lies further outside. And net worth is more unequal than assets, and it doesn't matter whether we look at France, whether we look at Germany, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This still holds true, same for UK. But notice straight off that although the same pattern holds, and we see that debt, for example, is disequalizing, you can just see that the curves are much, much more bent out for the United States than all these European countries. Oh, and I thought I wouldn't forget you. Here's Luxembourg. Okay, so Luxembourg's in there as well, along with all the other European countries, and you can just see for yourselves the picture's different. Now, this subject area is one that just recently has become extremely popular. It used to be that people researching this area, it was sort of a lonely voices that wanted to talk about this. Now, since what we might call the Thomas Piketty revolution, lots of people are looking at what has been happening to inequality overall. So I thought we might just pick up on this and look at a few facts about inequality in Europe compared with, well, what's going on elsewhere, whether we're looking at income, whether we're looking at wealth. So here's something from Team Piketty, very recent, from the World Inequality Report 2018. And first off, we look at incomes. What's the share of the top 10%? And what I would like to draw to your attention, I'll just go over here for 1 second. You can see we've got a little bit faintly, it's come out here, but the red curve is China. This color here is Russia. We've got Europe down here in green, and we've got yellow in terms of yellow is India, and the second one down there is US and Canada, North America. And what you find is that North American inequality just carries on rising and rising and rising over the period. Sorry, the contrast didn't come up too well on the screen here, but we're looking at the period from 1980 through to the present day. So it's a 30 years plus period. And so North America just carries on rising and rising. In the case of India, again, rising at a faster rate. Just look what's happening to these curves here, which represent what's happening in Russia and in China. The sort of precipitate takeoff here. Europe just sort of carries along fairly gently. What would happen if we were to look, that's incomes, if we were to look at wealth inequality? Now here we've got data going back over a century, and again, because of the way that's come up on the screen, I should tell you what the figures are involved here. So we're going back to just after Pareto's era, 1910 here, pretty much up to the present day. And we've got China, in red for the dragon there. we've got, in this case, where the data come from, we've got France here, we've got Russia, the UK, and the US. And what you find is that for those countries where we know a lot about what's happened over a long period, you could take us through the First World War, the Second World War, this declining share of the top 10%. And in the case of in the case of the US, this one here, again, it picks up quite dramatically in more recent times. Look at what happens to wealth inequality, the share of the top 10% in China, in Russia. Extraordinary the way it's taken off. You get a similar picture when you look at the top 1% of wealth. So even if you're not really into figures, you can pretty soon see what's going on. What is kind of interesting in there, just if I can extract out of here a couple of particular observations, is the behavior of, let me get this right, France, which is the second one here, this color, and the UK, which is this green one here. And they move very closely together towards the end of the period. So it's interesting with recent research looking back at sort of a representative mainland European country and comparing it with the UK, France and the UK, just looking at how wealth has evolved in recent years. And clearly there is some divergence. We're looking at here at the role of inheritance as a percent of overall income of the country. But in recent years, you can see France is in blue and the UK is in red. And the role of inheritance seems to be increasing rather more rapidly in France than in the UK. But by and large, the two series mimic each other, and it's suggested that essentially the French have got better data, it has to be admitted, than the UK data. And we see this also when we look at the role of transmitted wealth, that's inheritance and so on, compared with personal wealth. From the UK, it seems to be that the role of inheritance is falling, but in the case of France, essentially they're picking up much better the role of transfers. So what can we, transfers within the lifetime. So it appears, just looking at the evidence, that there is a European pattern, if you like, of inequality, whether we're looking at income or whether we're looking at wealth. And that pattern is very different from the other big world players. The European pattern, when you compare it with in North America, whether you compare it with China or with Russia. So let's move on to the third area that I wanted to speak about. What do people think about these things? People like you and me, whatever your specialism in life may be. What do people think about inequality? And do they care about inequality? Let me just draw to your attention a study of the perceptions of inequality that was published in France about 10 years ago. So it's this thing here. Let's move on to figure number 3. So there's figure number 1, figure number 2, figure number 3. How do people view inequality? So this study done on perceptions of inequality, where they asked people, representative population in the different countries over the years, and they said, well, has inequality in your country over the last years increased, decreased, stayed the same? And it is fairly evident that if we look at the European countries, because it's a French survey, France gets a little box around it, okay, fine. So your red is inequality increasing, your blue is inequality decreasing, and the green stay the same. What is remarkable is that you can really divide these countries simply by that line. So there's the European view that, yeah, looking at what's happened in the last 10 years, inequality is going up. In the United States, it is extraordinary that we've seen the facts, even if, it's pictures are new to you or whatever. We've seen the facts, and yet the perception of inequality is simply not there, the increase in inequality. So, a little snapshot. Why don't we move on to consider how this affects areas that maybe have an impact on policy. So, people's perceptions to people's preferences. Because one thing I think we can all agree on is that the way people perceive facts is going to affect their attitudes maybe in terms of content or discontent with their lot in life. Think of the last picture that we saw here. And their attitudes perhaps that their representatives use to form policy. So we can think of all sorts of things that are going to affect this. So here, chatting to people, we're talking about how Luxembourg today is very different from when I first started coming to Luxembourg in the 80s. You say the same thing of the country where I'm from. Clearly, there are going to be more diverse influences within the body politic, let's say. But one thing we should realize is that preferences, we shouldn't just see them as some kind of exogenous thing imposed from the outside or some kind of immutable thing. Yeah, they change with the facts. So culture changes, political differences change. And it's at this point that we come back to the concept of identity. You recall in the first part of the talk I said, well, maybe we can see a European identity in the way the subject's been approached. The second part we thought, well, maybe in terms of the facts. What about the way in which identity directly affects people's preferences about income distribution and wealth distribution? Well, it's the basis of some recent research that's been done at the London School of Economics. And it's really going back to the fundamental Paretian idea of his agenda, which is where he's combining economics and other social science and using the facts to give us some feel for what can be done, what could be done. So if we were trying to think about the concept of social identity, how would this affect preferences concerning inequality? Well, we might think of particular reference points that people make, so maybe with respect to their own country, maybe with respect to Europe as a whole, maybe comparing themselves with countries outside Europe. We think perhaps of social norms that develop over time. And it's clear that the explicit development of a European identity, if it has indeed developed, and I think one doesn't really need to look very far outside to see how it has developed, clearly this should have some sort of impact. It should affect, if you like, solidarité or whatever. It should affect people's experiences. But the trick is, if I can call it a trick, how do we introduce that within some kind of scientific model? So, say we've been with my colleague, Joan Costa-Font from Barcelona, who now works in the LSE. We've been looking at this subject. So how do we approach the concept of identity, within the context of a scientific model? Here's an area, again, which has been developed within economics field relatively recently, borrowing from other social sciences. And the way to think about it is that it's as though we've got some kind of sense of belonging to some sort of club. Now, you hear an Englishman talking about clubs and possibly you're thinking of something like that. Well, it's not a bad start because, clubs have certain norms, certain rules, even if we were talking about a London club in Piccadilly or somewhere like that. But what we're talking about here, the kind of social ties that, even without thinking about it, people find that they affect their behavior, so subconsciously perhaps. So people feel some kind of club loyalty. They're not all the time sort of saying to themselves, do I belong to this club or that club? But it is going to affect such things as their support for things like the welfare state, things like various aspects of taxation that may be associated with redistribution. So that's what the research that the LSE did that we were focusing on. We acknowledge the fact that individuals may find themselves associated with multiple groups, multiple identities, if you like. As it happens, I made the reference a moment ago to Pareto's use of data and Vermeulen's use of data. The UK is a great place to look at this because, you know, I was born in the UK, in the south of England. Do I identify with England? Do I identify with Great Britain? Do I identify with the UK? It gets a whole lot more complicated if you're interested in sport, and you will know that, again, from Outremanche, you know, there's all sorts of stuff goes on in terms of identity. So the same thing could be true here. I mean, whether the person is like Pareto's mother, born in France, or his father in Italy, or whatever. Again, you've got associations which have all sorts of little ties, the way you think in terms of language and the way what you eat, all sorts of things like that, that are then going to affect your concept of identity. So, what about this idea of European identity? So, it should be the case that identifying yourself as European has some sort of impact on values. So other studies, not our own, have shown that it affects people's tolerance criteria. It affects people's respect for democratic principles. This comes as no surprise, I should imagine, to anybody in the audience here today. But one thing that we wanted to pick up in our own research is that the development of EU institutions should, as it were, affect the balance of the different little identity associated, these things you've got in your head which connect you to all sorts of institutions around you. And it's going to have an impact on people's attitudes and the way those attitudes are expressed. So what about attitudes specifically to inequality? It turns out that there are some very useful data that we can get, survey data, which enable us directly to look at this. But in order to do this, we need, if you like, specific identity markers, things that we can observe and say, yes, that could reasonably have an impact across European countries, an impact on people's attitudes, in particular attitudes to distribution. So we focused on studying the European Value Survey, which specifically has, sorry, this doesn't again come out very clearly, but I'll just mention to you the kind of key questions on redistributive preferences. So how do you agree with the prospects of the proposition, maybe income should be made more equal, so rated on a scale from 1 to 10, or we should forget about income differences altogether. What about your national pride? Hey, come on, we all have it in there somewhere. So, you know, very proud, quite proud, not proud at all, you know, so it's in there somewhere. And what about your confidence in the European Union? Again, you might say, well, should we believe these figures? What's so a snapshot of opinion that provides data, for example, on looking at this redistributive preferences, and what we're looking at here is the way in which these different curves here, the way they've changed over time, so that what we find is that redistributive preferences ranged on a scale of 1 to 10 have progressively become, as we move up the scale here, those are the early years, here's the later years, they've become more salient in recent years. So people have polarized perhaps somewhat in terms of their redistributive preferences. We didn't just want to tabulate that. We thought, well, maybe we can find specific markers of identity. So I guess it would not be a huge surprise to look at the euro. And clearly the euro has been seen as an experiment. There was a book that came out from someone who worked on the Economist newspaper called the Euro Experiment. But what we want to talk about is as a social science experiment. Recently, economists generally have got very interested in experimental evidence. And we can see the introduction of euro not only in its initial phases in the early 2000s, but the later phases in 2004 and so on, as an experiment, because explicitly, when the euro was introduced, they said, well, look, this little chap is going to explicitly capture the idea in some respect of European identity. And more generally speaking, when you think about currencies, if you remember the time when there was the Luxembourg franc or whatever it was, if you're from elsewhere beforehand, you look at the currency and it has some kind of association with identity. So for example, in my own country, I mean, clearly the monarchy, the flag, the currency all have some kind of identity marker associated with them. So we're focusing just on the euro, not the euro experiment, but the euro as a marker in our quasi-experiment. So what we find is that the introduction of the euro and the period after 2003, we wanted that so that we could have a before and after period. For those countries, we would then have that from the European Values Survey. It wouldn't apply to other countries. And we find consistently that this increases confidence in the European Union and it decreases the importance of national pride. And what we also find is that this gradual shift of the marker, if you like, of the markers for European identity, increase the preferences for redistribution. Now, I know that there will be skeptics in the audience, so let me just tell you something that we did to get our retaliation in first, if you like, for the skeptics. So some people would say, well, maybe it's going the other way around. Maybe the causation goes from, maybe identity is seen as the effect of the existence of redistributive mechanisms, and people say, oh, well, now these other things have happened. So maybe it works the other way around. Maybe there's a problem with timing. After all, people can anticipate their Europeanness before they formally join the euro. Maybe there are other changes that we ought to take into account. So we thought, well, let's see if there are other markers that we can identify from the survey data. So we looked at these things, such things as changes in history curricula, which obviously have an impact on the way people from childhood perceive the world around them, the education they get in citizenship, and even, don't laugh, even such things as, how do you do in the Eurovision? How do you do in the, for those moments, suddenly you forget Europe, you become British, you become French, you become whoever. Yeah? So we've got these proxies for, if you like, national identity markers to see whether or not we get a confirmation of the results we got from the Euro identity marker. So some of these things turn out to be quite powerful instruments for saying, well, do people have European identity? What we find is that indeed it's the case that the European EU identity is an important factor in determining people's attitudes to redistribution. So finally, what about some takeaway thoughts? I would suggest that if the little historical trip that we had looking at, I suppose we should call him Fritz Pareto now, Wilfredo Pareto, if this was new to you, he's worth a second, a third look at how his long-ranging influence on the way to analyze the world around us, not just botanist style to see how fast the inequality is growing, but what kind of social forces are there in shaping? From economics, I think there is a case to be made that there is a European pattern compared with elsewhere. And I think the evidence for that is when you look at the Pareto countries brought up to date, clearly there's a pattern that is remarkably different, let's say, from across the Atlantic. And with some of the recent evidence, we can see that it's remarkably different from what's happening in the big country developers such as China, such as India. Obviously, that's not completely convincing, but it is remarkable. For example, now, somewhere like the UK is perceived as more semi-detached from Europe, but nevertheless, look at the facts in terms of the inequality, and it's right in there with France, with Germany, with whoever, in terms of the outworking of inequality. And yes, such things as the euro as a currency unit was explicitly designed obviously for a variety of reasons, but in part to reinforce this concept of European identity. And it has. It has, in terms of the way people think about inequality, the way they think about redistribution. And that's where I'll stop.